Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar. I'm just going to start the session and give this a few moments to allow all of our attendees to join us from the waiting room. Okay, so I can see we've got people arriving in from the waiting room now. That's great. Okay, right. I think we will make a start so that we don't run over. So thank you for joining our session today from Analytical Factory. The topic today, richer insights through the power of voice technology using the Phoebe platform. So before we get into the core of the presentation, a few kind of housekeeping points. You'll notice as you join that all of your lines are muted, so we can't hear you. But hopefully you can hear us. There are two of us on the line today. My name's Rachel Clinton. I'm mostly in the background, fielding questions, making sure people are logged in correctly, etc. Our main presenter, Jarlath Quinn, will take over in just a second. We are recording the session, and that's so that later today we can send you an email that gives you a link to watch the recording back. You can share that with your colleagues. There'll be an opportunity for you to access the slides that we're using today in that email as well. So you will get all of these materials later on. You are very welcome to submit questions as we go through. There's a Q&A panel right at the bottom of your kind of Zoom control panel. Please submit any questions you have there. I'll field those and answer what we can in the background. Some of it will probably be covered in the session. And if for some reason we can't answer, then we'll make sure that we come back to you separately once the session has finished. So your question will get answered one way or another. Okay, Jarlath, do you want to take the session from here?
Yes, thanks very much, Rachel. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. We're going to be looking at the Phoebe platform. As Rachel has said, we're going to be going through this in a live demonstration this morning. So it's going to be some slideware. You're going to get a copy of the slides afterwards, and you're going to get a link to the video recording itself. Both Rachel and I work for an organization called Analytical Factory. We were founded in 2018, and there are 4 veterans of the analytics, data science, and research technology industries that work on it. That's basically including myself and Rachel. So we have a strong analytical data science type background. And the aim, of course, is to deliver voice-enabled technology solutions to research in other sectors. And we work very closely with the developers of Phoebe and are in contact with them on a regular basis. Phoebe's actually been causing quite a stir in the past couple of years and picking up a bunch of awards. I think you'll see why that is the case when we start getting into the demonstration itself. So the raison d'etre of Phoebe is that voice is still the most intuitive and natural and efficient way for people to communicate. What Phoebe has found when they've actually done their own research is that when people are given the opportunity to answer via their voice using a microphone, about 50% of people choose to do that. And that's kind of interesting because that's increasing over time. We're not starting to notice that that tends to be more prevalent among younger demographics. It tends to be pretty prevalent among people who are working and answering questions or providing feedback on mobile phones and tablet type technology. And that kind of makes sense, particularly when you consider that, of course, talking is generally faster than typing. Even when you're talking at a fairly relaxed pace, you're usually able to enter your results much faster and to give longer answers. And the third aspect of it is that there's actually quite a lot of information, as we will see, that is contained within the voice itself, within an audio signal. Lastly, spoken responses themselves tend to be longer, richer, and packed with revealing emotion data. Many researchers have noticed over the past few years that when it comes to open-ended responses in particular, people are either skipping over them or they're giving quite terse answers. So there's a lot of good reasons why capturing data through spoken responses makes sense both for the user and for the researchers or the people who are trying to capture the information to begin with. So we're going to start off talking about how Phoebe tackles that business of capturing information via the voice using the Phoebe plugin tool. And this is voice-enabled data capture Phoebe plugin. I'm just going to give you a quick demonstration around that, but suffice to say, the Phoebe plugin is a little tool that makes it easy to voice-enable pretty much any survey or web form. So it's going to be something that's obviously going to be of interest to people who are asking for feedback or who are trying to conduct studies online and designing questionnaires with open-ended questions. But it should be pointed out that we have a few customers knocking about who are actually using this to collect information, not really for survey purposes, but simply because they need a hands-free way to actually record results. They're working on factory floors, etc. And sometimes there are even issues around hygiene, particularly in a post-COVID environment where they don't want to necessarily be sharing touch screens with one another. So it's starting to bleed into these other applications, but certainly the early adopters of this are very much people within the research and qualitative research community. The Phoebe plugin is added to a survey platform, usually as a single line of JavaScript. You'll see an example of that. It's not difficult to do that. And we can customize it to work with pretty much any survey platform, though we've already created a number of standard JavaScript lines that we can add with some of the bigger survey platforms, such as ASCII and Qualtrics. It's also configurable. You'll see examples how it's configurable. And of course, it's especially useful on open ends. Respondents simply click on the icon to speak their answer if they so wish, if they're using something like a mobile phone, or they'll click if they're using a laptop using their mouse. It does, of course, streamline this user experience. It just makes it easier for them to give a rich and full answer. It feeds the transcriptions because, of course, it's turning the voice directly into transcribed words and letters of your voice responses directly onto your own survey platform of choice in real time. But at the same time, and crucially, it's actually securely loading the transcriptions and audio clips into another Phoebe product called Phoebe Portal, which we'll see later on. And Phoebe Portal allows us to perform things like emotion analysis and sentiment analysis. It allows us to listen to the audio data. So it's capturing the audio itself rather than it going off to Google or Apple. And that means that we can do some exploration and visualization of that audio signal and start to look at how the emotions correlate with different terms and topics and different phrases and answers to certain questions. Okay, we're just going to very briefly, I'm just going to skip out to a browser and just show you how Phoebe plugin works, and then we'll come back to it and look at a few more details around it. But this is just a really short little survey that I've got here. I'm going to load up a Chrome browser here. I'm going to right-click on this event feedback and open an incognito window. And you're going to see initially a mix of structured questions, so basic quantitative questions, which have not been voice enabled. There's one structured question, which is just basically a recommendation question, and then about 3 open-ended questions. So this the background to this is it's a survey that from a conference that people have attended. It's called the Voice Research. And I'm just going to start it by clicking on next. You notice it's here, we're using a Qualtrics platform. Hit next. And the first thing that comes up is just a standard 10-point scale recommendation. How likely are you to recommend the Voice Research to a friend or colleague? So I'm just going to say 8. I'm clicking on that and hitting next. Then I hit an open end. And the open end at this point has been voice enabled. The Phoebe microphone appears at that point. And my laptop is asking me for access, or Qualtrics asked me for access to the microphone. So I'll give it access to the microphone, hit allow. And then I'll click here to start. So I'll just click on the microphone icon. And what will happen then is that the question is read out. I'll give it a response. It will capture that response and transcribe it. And it will automatically jump to the next question. All of these aspects of the data capture, if you like, and the voice capture are configurable. This is just a choice that we've made for this particular one. So I'll click here.
What did you like most about the Voice Research?
I thought it was a really interesting conference with lots of opportunities for networking.
What did you like least about the Voice Research?
I thought the venue could have been better. It was difficult to find and badly equipped.
What What would be the most valuable experience we could facilitate at the voice research next time? Please list as many ideas as you'd like.
I'd like to have more time to talk to some of the speakers, as well as the opportunity to play with some of the software tools.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
Not at this time. And that's it. It's simply captured my responses there. You can see it's automatically switching to it. What's happened there is that the transcribed responses have gone directly to the Qualtrics platform, but they've also gone to the Phoebe portal platform if we wanted to do further analysis on that, or edit the responses, or change them, or do things like tagging based upon the topics that people have mentioned. If I just return to the slides here, a very simple, quick demo of Phoebe plugin gives you a flavor how it works. So adding the Phoebe plugin, how did we get it to do that? What did we do? Well, we just went onto the Qualtrics platform in my case, and I just added a line of JavaScript after the questions that I wanted to voice enable. But let's assume that it's you're using a platform which isn't a standard platform. Maybe it's something which is specific to your organization, or it's not very well known. What you could do then is simply share your survey URL with Phoebe or with us, and we'd pass it on. And Phoebe would then provide a customized JavaScript plugin that works with any survey platform. And you simply add that plugin to your survey, and now you're ready to customize. And to give you an idea of what the JavaScript looked like, that's a typical JavaScript there. That's for an Askia platform, as you can see there, Askia. And that simply loads the Phoebe microphone button, if you like, for that particular question, adds it in there. Now, we've actually started to expose some controls to the end user so they can switch things on and off. And here are some of the controls they can have. They can control whether or not the question is read out or not. They might not want that. They can specify how long Phoebe listens before the recording stops. And they can choose automatic switching to the next question and choose, of course, which questions should be voice enabled. So those little controls are available. And there's some thought that it's worth thinking about that, whether or not you want people to actually see the transcribed responses. Sometimes if they see that a word has been mistranscribed, because it will make mistakes, of course, we know that happens even when we're using our phone and using the microphone on our phone, that they want to correct it, and it can kind of interfere with the smoothness of the experience. Bear in mind that we can correct that later on, particularly if we're using the Phoebe portal platform, because we can hear the audio. And it's not difficult. It's not terribly time consuming in most cases, just to go through that and clean that up if there's a poor audio signal. I will say, however, that for when people have been using phones, and you're going to see a little example and hear some responses for when people have mostly been using their phone to give feedback. And the microphone quality on modern smartphones these days is extremely good. It tends to be better than what you would get on a laptop, especially if people aren't using a headset like I'm using now. So it's pretty good audio quality you get, even with background. And you'll hear some examples of responses where you can hear the TV in the background and stuff like that. It does a pretty good job of actually picking up the voice signal itself and transcribing it reasonably accurately. Okay, of course, there are always going to be questions around language and language support. So this is not an exhaustive list. It's a sample of the list of languages that we currently support. We currently support speech to text across all these different languages. And we also do emotion detection. We have different language modules, if you like, that will take account of the language that people are speaking in. And the emotion detection also is configured for that. The English language module has some rudimentary sentiment analysis in it, which is kind of useful. And of course, we support translation to English. So you'll see transcribed responses in native language or in English if you so wish. The data that's being captured, that should be pointed out, is stored in 2 data centers. One is potentially in the US, if you're a US company, or in Europe, if you want to work in Europe, and it's held securely. So it's fully GDPR compliant as you're working through that. Okay, what else can we talk about? Well, basically, how are clients currently using Phoebe plugin? Well, they're voice enabling all or a selection of questions on web forms. They're improving the user experience for respondents who prefer to use voice as a response mechanism on their device. They're capturing longer and more detailed responses to open-ended or verbatim questions, especially when they're completed on a smartphone or a tablet. And of course, they're saving money and time on transcription and translations costs. They're capturing the data direct to the preferred data platform, whilst also having the transcribed audio ready for emotion analysis in Phoebe Portal if they want to make use of that. In summary, Phoebe plugin makes it easy to capture and transcribe voice responses through any web form direct to your survey platform. It encourages more verbose responses, and it streamlines the user experience, and it makes the audio and transcriptions available to Phoebe Portal for emotion analytics as well as tagging and editing. I should point out that when we get the Phoebe Portal, I'll mention this again later on, you don't have to use Phoebe plugin to get your audio data on the Phoebe Portal. You may already have audio data that you've captured, and you can still upload that on the Phoebe Portal. Phoebe plugin is simply an optional way to capture and transcribe audio information. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about Phoebe Portal thus far. Let's have a little look at that and start to introduce that. What is Phoebe Portal? Phoebe Portal is a platform. It's, of course, a cloud-based platform where we can go and listen to the responses that have been captured. We can see the transcribed responses, the transcriptions. We can correct them and edit them. We can do things like tagging, and we can also perform things like emotion analytics as we're going through that. So let's have a look at that. So the raison d'etre, if you like, behind Phoebe Portal is that it reveals what's in people's heads and hearts by unlocking a valuable emotion data hidden in our speech. We will actually see an example right away. One of the first things we're going to look at is the difference between what somebody says and how they actually say it. So almost the difference between sentiment and emotion. And this is really at the heart of what Phoebe Portal is doing and the emotion analytics is doing, is that there is additional information here that isn't necessarily captured through standard analytical techniques. So how's it doing that? How's it doing emotion detection? Well, first of all, it's using sophisticated machine learning. As someone with a background in machine learning and classical statistics, it's not terribly unusual to me that this would be a typical application or an emerging application people will be working with. So audio data is just data like any other data. You can break it into ones and zeros. There is a signal in it. And when we pass this into what happens to be a recurrent neural network, it does something called feature extraction. Feature extraction is a term that's used in machine learning, which means it pulls out aspects of that data. So it pulls out features, variables, if you like, in the same way that you have a variable for income and gender and reflex reaction and blood pressure. This pulls out a number of key features. It then evaluates those features in terms of their usefulness to classify or categorize different emotional states. It is underpinned by research. This is research that's been around for a while. You can actually look that up. There's a little reference to some of the research that's been done in recognizing emotions in human speech in 2010. Some of the research goes back as far as 93. Murray and Arnold had a fairly seminal paper where they came up with 4 emotional state classifications: anger, happy, sad, and fear. And the features that they were extracting were things like speech rate, pitch average, pitch range, intensity, the voice quality in terms of breathiness or resonance, pitch change, whether pitch change was abrupt or smooth, articulations, whether it's tense or normal or slurring or precise. In fact, you can have any number of different features. You might have some of the research around this extracts a lot more features. We tend to extract more features using our own version of a similar type of model, and we classify them into not 4 emotions, but 5 different emotional states, which is happy, calm, anxious, sad, and strong. We'll talk about that in more detail, but strong here really refers to passionate, if you like, responses, enthusiastic responses. And what we find is that combinations of these emotional states mean that you get quite a rich spectrum of different types of nuanced emotion over time. And we have little guides that we can provide people, give them a bit of a steer on how to interpret that going on. But that's what's underpinning it, from a sort of scientific, from a sort of research standpoint. This is what's happening in the background. And our first example that we're going to look at is something that we planned a little while ago and worked really well for us, which is that very often the data we're dealing with is data that we simply can't share with you, of course, because it's anonymous when we're talking about our customers. We wanted to have more data that we could share with you. So we decided to do our own survey. And what we did was we ran our own little survey of just family and friends of Analytical Factory earlier in the year. And the idea was to showcase how easy and powerful Phoebe is as a platform for collecting and analyzing voice data. So this is what the survey actually looked like on a smartphone. We just pinged it out on emails and WhatsApp groups and stuff like that. And we had 3 questions. And the questions were all about food. So we called it the survey Food Heaven versus Food Hell. And the 3 questions were simply 3 open-ended questions, which were: what was your absolute favorite memory of food or confectionery when you were growing up, and why was it special? What was the worst thing you've ever eaten or cooked, and how did that happen? And if you walked into the restaurant of your dreams, what would you order and why? This is particularly at a time when people hadn't been in restaurants for a while, so they were really thinking a lot about it. And we've deliberately chosen these questions to provoke an emotional response. People have emotional memories from childhood. They usually have quite strong opinions or memories about food that they've eaten. They often have strong opinions of the best food or the nicest food, or the thing that conjures up the nicest memories. And the results were really, really interesting, because we got quite a big difference between what people said and how they said it. Very often when they were talking about the worst thing they've ever eaten, for example, they were laughing. So you get quite a happy response, but they're talking about something that's pretty disgusting to them. And even when they're talking about their memories of food, often their memories they're very happy memories, but they're tinged with quite a lot of sadness because it's a while ago and they might be talking about their parents. So it worked brilliantly. And we're going to just skip out to it and have a little look at it. So let's have a look. Let's take a look. So I'm going to skip out here to my Chrome tab again here. I'm just going to go to a link to a survey to the Phoebe portal. I'm going to log in. And I'm going to skip directly to one of the projects here. And you can see some report tabs. There's a number of tabs here. I'm going to work through these in turn, but I just want to jump straight to perhaps the most important tab, which is the logs tab. So these are the responses that people are given. These are the transcribed responses here that you can see. Here's the respondent ID. Here's the timestamp that when it was run. Here's the length of it. And there's some buttons here with regard to whether or not we download the MP3 file, so we can look at that, whether or not we can see the transcription itself, or whether we can play the transcription. And I've also added little tags here. These are tags that relate to the questions, but there are tags within the individual responses. So this is additional metadata that I'm adding, which helps me then search for it and do comparisons in reports. If they're talking about, let's say it was a commercial application, if they were talking about brands or something like that, I might tag it up by that. If they were talking about context, such as family versus work, I might tag it with that. So that I can then do further searching and say, well, what is the difference between work and family in terms of people's emotional response when they're talking about using this particular product or something like that, so we can do some sort of comparison. So we got a decent number of responses because we asked 3 questions. It isn't a vast sample. It's a relatively small sample size. You'll notice along the side here, we have this thing here called emotion and sentiment, these 2 little bars here, and you'll notice that they don't necessarily correlate with each other. So one of the first things we're struck by is this response from my friend, where if I just show you the transcript, if I click on transcript here, it says, I'll just hit edit here, it says, oysters, I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat. And I tagged up oysters and hate. So I could right click on this and I could tag that as well. I could add a little tag to that. I'll click on edit later on and just show you what else is going on there. But if I hit download, I could download that transcription itself, and it would download in a little PDF format. It's quite useful, for example, when you've got a transcription where you're talking about interviews and you have an interviewer and respondent, or if you've got a focus group where you've got, James, John, and Samir or something like that, and they're talking to each other, you get quite a nice little transcript that can be downloaded with a PDF, showing the question, showing the answer, and showing the timestamp of when those were given. So if I just look at this one again, we can see that she's talking about something that's really disgusting to her. So her sentiment score is really, quite low. That's the lower bar here. You can see, she's talking about hate. But her emotional score is really quite high. And you think to yourself, well, why should that be? And the answer, of course, is if you listen to the response. Let's just play it so we can hear it first of all. So you can hear her laughing, she's actually laughing a little bit. Phoebe detects that, and Phoebe is seeing that as a positive emotional statement. We can actually see that in real time when we look at an emotional tracker. So here we run it again, and we can see the transcript across the top, a ticker tape, and we can see the response itself being classified with overlapping emotions.
Oysters. I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat.
So you've got to bear in mind that Phoebe's not paying attention to the words that she's speaking, that Alex is speaking there. It's just listening to the tone of her voice and it's classifying it. So it's definitely picking up something that the text itself doesn't normally pick up. And it's adding data to it. It's giving us a score for different emotional states. Okay, let's look at what else we've got here. So we've got little buttons here where we can play it, we can download it, we can look at the transcript, we can edit the transcript. If I just click on the edit the transcript here and go to edit here, you'll see that I can actually click on sections of this. And this shows me the file baseline. If I pick a whole section of this here, it will give me the file baseline emotion. It gives me the project baseline emotion. So this is usually just an average across all the project. Let me just see if I can find another one here. So if I'm going to go down here and say, let's pick this thing here. If I click this one. So if I click here, I can see that actually this section here now has an emotional response just for that section. And it's calm. Whereas over here, this one's happy. This section here is happy. This is the overall file, the file itself. So the profile for that file. And this is, again, the project baseline, which if I just zoom out a bit, you can see the whole thing. So we can click individual bits. We can choose something here, like, for example, lunch or something like that. And I can create a little tag from that and say, let's tag that up, give it a name and call it food or something like that, or lunchtime or something like that. And give it a type and call it, eating or something like that. And give it a color and just create that little tag for it if I want. And then I can search in that tag later on. If I notice that there's something that's wrong in here, like, for example, it hasn't transcribed, it looks like it's done a pretty good job of transcribing this. But, if there was a mistake, I could just literally just click on this and just edit that, and change that if I wanted to. So this is how I correct things. Let's look at another a couple of responses, though. I wanted to look at responses which compare and contrast two responses to two questions from the same speaker. So if I just look down here, let's see if I can find this one. So here's one. This is a person talking about the worst thing they've ever eaten, and the same person talking about what their favorite memory of food is. And again, bear in mind that it's not listening to the words, it's simply listening to the pitch and the tone and classifying that into an emotional state.
The worst thing I've ever eaten was actually my mum's pork mince boiled to within an inch of its life. It was bland, it was wet, it was just soggy mince, and it was a poor thing to serve. That was the worst thing I've ever had.
So you can see there is when you're getting combinations of strong emotions, so passionate, quite elevated emotion, quite emphatic emotions, and anxious, it does tend to be associated with emotions in this context, in the context of this survey, and context is very important, of course, here. In the context of this survey, that's often associated with feelings of disgust. So here's the same person talking about their happiest memory, if you like, the fondest memory. And again, it's just listening to his voice. It's not paying attention to the words.
When growing up, my favorite food was the Findus crispy pancakes. And the reason was because it was the only thing that my mum didn't crucify. Everything else she used to ruin. But those, she used to sort them out good and proper. And as a hungry lad, used to wolf down loads of them. Loved it.
It's interesting that the one bit of anxiety here that he gets when he talks about anything anxious is when he talks about his mother crucifying the food that he was given. And that's the only bit that peaks up on the anxiety emotion there. So really interesting there, comparison of the same person speaking, giving an answer to two different questions, and it picking up a completely different emotional profile based upon that. Here's another one. This is actually my sister speaking about her favorite, what she would order in the restaurant of her dreams. So I'll just see what Caution says. And it's interesting. So she's a little bit nervous at the start when she's giving an audio response. She knows her voice is being recorded, so her anxiety is up. And she's also choosing. She's thinking about choosing. You often notice that when people are choosing in this context, there's hesitation, and it's kind of detecting that hesitation is slightly tense, slightly anxious. But once she starts talking about what she really loves, it's a very, very different story.
Okay, so the rest front of my dreams is pretty much up and down the high street. It's not of dreams. It's not some big fancy restaurant or doing cordon bleu food or anything like that. My husband and I have this chat about what would you have if your as your death row meal, your last meal that you could have, and mine's is always sandwiches. I think sandwiches are delicious. I love them. I love them in every shape and form. Bread is like my number one enemy, and I try and avoid it, but I absolutely love sandwiches. I like food that you could pick at, whether it be like olives and salami and nice cheeses and grapes and stuff. But just a lovely selection of sandwiches would be my absolute favorite meal.
So there's somebody with a very different accent, but you know, it's given a very different emotional profile that we've seen previously. It's a very strong signal on happiness. She's really blissing out. And it's interesting that the one time she gets an anxious peak when she's in the middle of it is when she says that bread is my number one enemy. It just picks up a little anxiety peak there. Again, not paying any attention to the words that are being spoken, purely the tone that's being spoken. So this is working very well. Let's look at one where we're going to look at the last example from this survey here. One of my favorite ones is again from Alex, and she's actually talking about a really favorite memory, but it's what's happening is it's not peaking out with emotion. You know, it's not peaking out with happiness. It's not necessarily the emotion that you would necessarily associate when she's talking about something that's really quite a warm memory. The sentiment's very high, the emotion's somewhat cooler. Why should that be? Well, again, if we listen to it and pay attention to it, we can see why it's classifying this emotion not as happiness, but as something else.
Warm hot chocolate on rainy days, because always when it was raining a lot in my childhood, my mom would make warm cakes for us, and I love it, and I try to make it for my kids too nowadays when it's raining.
So this is peaking on sadness. Sadness doesn't necessarily mean depression. Okay, so the first thing, we are trapped inside the words that we're using to describe these emotions. We could use slightly different terms to describe them in the same way that when you do sentiment analysis, you're somewhat trapped inside those words, and there might be greater subtlety. What we're listening here is we're listening to a wistful response, and it
My childhood, my mom would make warm cakes for us, and I love it, and I try to make it for my kids too nowadays when it's raining.
so it's possible for quite a warm, happy, fond memory to be classified as sad when it's within that context and it's wistful. Okay, so let's look at some of the other output that we can get here. So if I move across the tabs here, I'm just going to look at something which is pretty obvious. Remember, this isn't a very large sample size. We haven't got particularly rich emotion clouds, but we can have filter controls here. So we can have additional filter controls for emotion clouds here. If I click on these, I can filter by different questions. If I just pick 2 emotion clouds here, and I'll just look at, say, something like strong versus calm. Let's look at that. Strong versus calm. They're kind of at opposite ends of one another. And what words are peaking there? So strong is seeing things like dream and restaurant, and worst is coming out. So people are really saying when they're giving strong, passionate answers, they're talking about the restaurant of their dreams. And they're talking about calm, we're seeing things like terms like good, beetroot and cheese, certain types of words, friends, house, smell, that type of thing. You will get worst coming up here as well, but it's just not popping in the same way. You can actually just rock it again a little bit and it'll give you a slightly different build on that. So if you do it again, slightly different, but the same sizes. So it's interesting to see what words pop against different emotions. It'd be particularly useful if you've got quite a rich sample and you're looking perhaps at brand names, for example. Okay, so that's us done with the food heaven versus food hell. This isn't a commercial example, of course. It's not one where it's been used in anger, if you like. Let's switch to a different example where we can have a little look more at the reports to give you a sense of the reports that can be generated from this additional data that we're creating. You'll notice here that on my food heaven, food hell here, I can have emotion clouds. I can drill them down by extra filters here. So you can create your own custom filters. We have something called an emotional resonance score, which is kind of the positive or negative emotion. So here we can see that school, mentions of school, is actually giving, believe it or not, it's only 3 mentions, not very large, but the scale is pretty much in the positive side, if you like, up here. Whereas if I look at some of the other tags I've created down here, I've created tags down here, I've got things like my colleague Bernie had a pretty bad experience with Indian food on one occasion, so that's coming out as pretty negative. So these are the kinds of things one can create. You also see something called an emotional trigger report, which I'm going to show you in a moment. This is where we are looking at snatches of responses. So when people say, well, when people are happy, what are they talking about when they're happy? You know, what are the phrases they're using? So we could, for example, filter out some of the questions, say, you know, what was the worst thing you've ever eaten? What was the best thing you've ever eaten? That type of thing. And just filter them. Let's look at the best thing. What was your fondest memory from childhood? We're getting a lot of happiness scores here, getting some anxiety as well, and strong scores. We can see what the phrases are associated with it, compared to, you know, what was the worst thing you'd ever eaten. And you're actually getting quite a lot of happy stuff here, where people are talking about happy memories, but something that went wrong, or they're laughing when they're talking about. And then we look at the question around the restaurant of your dreams. What are they talking about here? So we're seeing happiness scores here. What a peak happiness score here of 52%. When somebody's talking about, well, I would order something fishy, crustaceans, or something I wouldn't bother making at home, which is either too fiddly or scary. Let's jump to an actual example based on some real data in a commercial context. So now you've been introduced to this. This is Dynata data. If I click to this, so when you get to Phoebe, you're going to land on a home page here. You'll see some information about the latest news around Phoebe and some of the awards it's been winning. If you click on a survey, your own survey, here is the Dynata survey. This one has a little dashboard at the start. So it's giving me, across these many questions that have been asked around the pharmaceutical industry, there's a different sort of emotional score range. And it's giving me the overall, across the whole survey, the overall emotional profile. This is kind of an average. It's probably less interesting to us. We can also see that there's a lot of tags here associated with various types of illnesses, various types of healthcare and treatment, if you like, and even locations, as well as certain terms. And we also have a little overlay chart here looking at the strong emotions, calm emotions, anxious emotions, overlaid with sentiment. So even, again, here we're seeing some sad emotions have quite positive sentiment associated with them, whereas, as you might imagine, the anxious emotions tend to have more negative sentiment associated with them. These are the words versus how things are spoken. And then on the reports tab here, we have a similar thing. We have pie charts that we can click on. We have a scatter plot looking at emotion versus sentiment. Very useful if you want to identify areas or outliers where people are saying one thing, but the way in which they say it doesn't correlate with that. We had examples of that in a study recently where people were saying that they really weren't that bothered about monetization. It wasn't important to them. But every time people talked about it, their anxiety scores went up. So the way in which they talked about monetization wasn't necessarily correlating with the actual sentiment that they were expressing. And then we get to the logs. So let's look at the logs here. So I'm going to, again, look at one of these ones here. This is going to talk about this. This is a question asking someone about their peak emotion or a time of stress. So we can see that it's quite a long response here. They've got quite positive sentiment, generally speaking, but their emotion is negative. That's across the long response. If we listen to the first half of it, you'll see that this person is remembering something which is really quite anxiety inducing for them. And we can see why. So that gives you a sense of that person's anxiety rising in response to that question. We've got another one down here. If I just see if I can find this question, if I say filter just on that one alone and come back to the study, where somebody's answering the same question, but it's kind of a mix of emotions because they're talking about going for a job interview and thinking the relief of having it over and thinking that they've got it, and then the worry that maybe they haven't got it. So it's kind of a mix of different emotions. Let's just see if I can find it here for a second. Here we go.
My peak moment of emotion was when I completed my interview for a new job. I felt great relief, anxiety lifted, but also worry over the hope that I would get it.
So again, we're seeing contrasting emotional profile in answer to the same question because the situation is slightly different. If we go to the emotion clouds here, we can filter on them in exactly the same way that we did beforehand. We've even got a male-female filter here. So if I go for female, now again, if I look at something like anxious versus, let's say anxious versus calm. Let's go for anxious versus calm. And just see if there's anything pops there. So anxiety is associated, this is the negative one with medication, weak time coming, money, that type of stuff versus here, drugs, not quite as high as peaking quite as high. This one, we can compare and contrast that against males and females, and we can even zoom in certain questions. Let's go to the Explorer. I just want to go across to this tab here, the Explorer tab. This is where we can just search for a term. We may not have tagged everything up, but we can just search for a term. So let's search for something which is fairly emotive. I'm going to search for the term family and see that. So we're getting a lot of responses here where people talking about family. And what I can do is I can click 2 responses. I'm going to pick the first one and the last one, and then do a comparison of selection to help kind of tease out a narrative or a story. Again, 2 very contrasting responses to that term. We can listen to this first one.
My dad is diabetic. A bit concerned about that. And also there are some other diseases like Parkinson's that I'm worried about. Although I think I'm of the age now where I probably don't have to be concerned about it.
Okay, versus this one down here.
I think they create joy in my life. I laugh. And I have my family has hypertension. The big thing is making an effort to exercise. Bad people are bad.
So you can see it's a much more complex picture here because people are talking about the families, talking about the medication, and you can see the overlay and the contrasting emotions as in real time. And when we search for this, it just tries to find enough space, if you like, around that to give us some sort of sense of context. We can save those clips out and use them to to enrich our stories, if you like. If we go back to the reports over here, we also see a peak emotion report that we're generating. This is just stuff that is kind of standard report output. Everything can be turned into numbers and sent out for other people to generate their own reports. In fact, most of our customers are doing that. They're asking for these emotional resonance scores for these values to be punched out so that they can go and then build reports in Excel. And if I jump back out to the slides at this stage, we can see some examples of that. So how are our clients making use of Phoebe Portal? Well, they're leveraging the AI capabilities of Phoebe Portal to process and visualize and score the shifting emotional characteristics of the human voice every 3 seconds. That's how it's categorizing them on 3-second bursts, as we can see. It's applying emotion analysis capabilities to short form, sometimes less than 30 seconds, and even long form, up to several hours of human voice audio. So we've had like, quite long interviews and from 2 people, or even examples of focus groups. We've got 3 or 4 people. It's creating new numeric emotion data. So in the same way that sentiment analysis will create data for us using text mining, this creates emotion data for us. So new data is being generated. They're creating their own bespoke tags, their own segment groups and filters to add valuable dimensions for reporting analysis. And they're making use of insightful analysis and reporting to identify and pinpoint emotional responses to certain topics, themes, and ideas. As an example of that, this would be something that exists in Excel. So we're looking at different concepts here that have been punched out, and we've simply highlighted above average and below average emotional response scores to these different concepts. So if they're above average, they're in the sort of red zone, if you like, and if they're below average in the yellow zone. So that'd be an example of an emotional score matrix. They're also, of course, using word clouds, which are filtered by segments, concepts, and themes. They're taking little video footage of the temporal emotion analysis to show the interplay of the emotional characteristics as the respondents speak to kind of enrich their story and narrative. And they're generating summary reports and charts like pie charts and bar charts and scatter plots using specific project filters and selections in exactly the same way if they were using something like sentiment analysis and talking about positive or negative sentiment. So Phoebe Portal helps us tell the story in a compelling way by creating custom reports to visualize trends. We can search for keywords and scan the surrounding text for context. We can uncover these telling little micro moments of peak emotion buried in longer answers. We can bring our analysis to life by downloading specific audio clips. And we can export the Phoebe ERS, the emotional response data, out onto your platform so you can do your own analysis. And we can even deliver comparisons across borders with local language transcriptions and optional translation. In short, Phoebe Portal transcribes and analyzes uploaded audio data from survey responses, interviews, and focus groups of multiple speakers in multiple languages. There's also translation of transcribed audio to English, and it's supported for many languages. It does not require a Phoebe plugin that's independent of it. And the audio can be in almost any format, even when it's extracted from video recordings, something to bear in mind. Lastly, before we finish up here today, you should be aware that just this week we've announced the launch of Phoebe Live. And Phoebe Live delivers real-time emotional intelligence. Phoebe Live transcribes, analyzes, and displays emotion in real time as people are being interviewed or while things are actually being broadcast potentially. It allows interviewers therefore to ask smarter questions based on the observed emotional state and to guide the questioning, if you like. Identify coaching opportunities to improve empathy and generate new data to predict outcomes more accurately, and to do things like monitoring call center activity to intervene as needed. So there, some of the early adopters who were trying this out and trialing for us were using it to record audio and deploy emotion analysis, of course, in real time, and even to apply it against things like broadcast events like speeches or interviews or qualitative research discussions. They're using it to guide and facilitate more insightful discussion and to identify and mitigate potential issues or problems in real time. And of course, at the same time, they're saving money on time on transcription costs. So the full Phoebe platform is pretty simple. It's nothing like as complicated as a lot of platforms. There's a Phoebe plugin. They're all optional in each other. There's the portal, which is, of course, the website where we can go on and we can analyze our data, export our data out there, and really bring our story to life, our narrative to life, and do some very interesting comparison of one group or one topic against another within the dimensions of emotion analysis. And then there's the new Phoebe Live platform, which is being produced. I do hope you found that useful. I think there are some questions. Rachel, if you're still online, are any questions here which I can answer? So let me just have a little look at them. So.
Yeah, I've been answering them in the background. They're mostly about kind of language and accents. How does it deal with different accents and strong accents? Which languages are supported, those sorts of things, which I think I've covered in the background.
Okay, that's great. If you do have any other follow-up questions, please do reach out to us. You'll have heard there during the demonstration, there was actually quite a lot of different accents. It copes quite well with accents. The bigger issue I have found is when I'm doing correcting transcripts is actually just audio quality. That's an issue where it's really hard for me, even for me, to detect what people are saying if the quality is very poor. But we've done stuff with samples in where people are speaking what is technically known, what people colloquially known as Singlish in Southeast Asia. We've had a lot of different regional accents across the UK, and you've heard some accents there across the US. With bearing in mind that transcription isn't that big a deal if you're more focused on the emotion analytics, because of course it's the sound and the tone that people are working with. If it's the main thing that you're trying to do, then you need to bear in mind that if you're using Phoebe Portal, you can hear the actual audio itself, and you can correct any mistranscriptions. And if the audio signal is pretty decent, it doesn't take very long, assuming it's not a massive survey, to do that. It's something we would regularly do. So we haven't found it to be an absolute showstopper at this stage. Thanks very much. If you want to see more examples of this, we've got some recorded videos and little snippets online, but bear in mind, of course, that you're going to get a recording of this sent out to you afterwards. So feel free to share that with friends or colleagues if you think they'd be interested, and do reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thanks very much, and we look forward to you logging in again in the future.